I'm going to show you a project planner template in Excel. This is especially handy if you don't have Microsoft Project or other project planning software. So first, on the timeline worksheet, you'll see we have a typical Gantt chart representation or a calendar view of the tasks. Red would be planned tasks, actual is green. On the overview worksheet, we have two charts, the costs, plan versus actual, and also the tasks. So how do you get started with this project planner template? First thing you want to do is go to the drop-downs worksheet. This is where you define the drop-downs that you'll use to make your selections when defining your tasks. So you'll see there are borders around these different sections on the worksheet. The border represents a particular drop-down. So you need to enter information within that border. Now I'm using a demo spreadsheet that's already been filled out. Let me show you one of the things you have to be aware of. The entries in the drop-downs need to be contiguous, all in a row without a blank separation. So if I were to enter something not contiguous, something like this, you see there's a blank between most of the selections and other selection. I'll show you now on the task entry where that drop down exists. If I click on the drop down, you'll see the blank, but you don't see the entry you just made. So instead, move that entry so that it's contiguous. And now when we go back and look at that drop down, you'll see your selection is there. So very important as you are creating your drop down selections, ensure they are all in a row, no blanks in between the selections. Also important, you need to set up all of these drop downs before you enter any tasks. That's important because if you modify an entry later, that won't be reflected. And let me show you what I mean. So on the task entry selection, we have sister selected here. If I go to the drop downs and I change sister to aunt, now you'll see sister is still in that drop down. If you look at the drop down, you'll see it's been replaced by aunt, but sister is not dynamically refreshed. This is important because if you have a lot of entries already in this worksheet, and then you modify a drop down after the fact, you may need to update a lot of entries. Really important to ensure you have these drop downs filled out the way you want them in advance. Now, on the other hand, you can add new entries and that doesn't affect anything you've already entered task-wise. It's only the modifications that you need to ensure you've taken care of before entries, or you'll have some manual updating to perform. Now I want to show you the vendors worksheet. So you'll notice we have a vendors drop-down selection here. On the vendors worksheet, you'll see those same references in column A. The vendors worksheet is a reference worksheet. You do not have to use this worksheet, but anything that you enter as selections in the vendor dropdown will appear in column A. And a point of reference, cells that appear with a gray background are calculated fields, and you should not modify those. You should not type over those. So on the vendors worksheet, the vendors' names will be populated for you from the drop downs that you created. And then you can enter phone, contact, email, website, any file references, and the address of the location. Again, just for reference, you're not required to use that worksheet. It's just for your own purposes. Now let's look at task entry. On the task entry worksheet is where you will enter all the tasks you have to perform. Now I'm using a demo worksheet that already has entries made for you, but a couple of points to note here. The task entry worksheet contains a dynamic table. You'll notice there is color banding to help you identify the row that you're looking at. On this worksheet, as you enter tasks, the color banding will automatically appear for you. So for example, if I type a new task, not very creative, you'll see immediately that color band is created for you. Also, you'll notice column A is populated for you. Again, this is a gray column. You do not enter information into that column. It's populated for you. And on the far right, you'll notice column P is also gray and auto-populated. You do not enter information into that column. And you notice a number of cells have now appeared with a red background. Cells with a red background identify fields that are expected to be included. They're not mandatory to enter. However, if you don't enter information into those cells, the red cells, then other aspects of the spreadsheet will not function for you very well. So you really want to enter that information. Let me just populate that information. Now all the information is populated. I'll quickly just go through and show you the different drop-downs. So first and foremost, the status drop-down is the one drop-down you do not control. This contains 3 entries: planned, which means not yet started; in progress, already started but not completed; and finally, completed. Everything has been done. The planned cost and the actual cost have no drop-downs. They're just free-form entry. You enter the relevant numbers. Assignee drop-down is from the drop-downs that you created. Planned start date and actual end date are just free format fields. The category drop-down, again, is from the drop-downs worksheet that you created your drop-downs in. Same for stage and phase. Same for priority. And also for vendor. One other point to note in this spreadsheet is the plus sign at the top. When you click this, it will expand columns. There's an additional field here called Notes, where you can enter additional information related to the tasks. You don't have to enter information there. It's just in the event you need to add some additional information. Now let's look at our timeline. So you'll see the task that we just entered, new task, has appeared here, has the reference numbers for easier evaluation. If you have a lot of tasks, it's going to be easier to find your task by looking at the reference number. And you'll see it reflects that the task is not yet started. If we scroll to the right, you'll see the red bar indicates the planned time frame. The key elements in this worksheet are cell B3. This is your start date. You do not enter information into that cell. Again, it's a gray cell. You don't enter information there. It's automatically populated based on the dates you entered in task entry. So the earliest date needed to identify information for your tasks is reflected in cell B3. And let me show you that's dynamic. So our first task here is research countertops beginning on the 10th of February. If I modify that task, let's say it was planned to begin on 20th of February. Now let's look at the timeline. You'll notice the start date is now different because the earliest task that was on the 10th is no longer on the 10th, so we don't need to display that. And the block information in the calendar view is reflected immediately. As I mentioned before, red is planned tasks, green is actual, and that's again based on the information in task entry. There are planned dates and there are actual dates. There's also information highlighted in purple. You'll notice here there's a purple column and there's also a purple border around this column. Purple indicates today's date. and that's why that's reflected in that way. Now let's look at navigation for this timeline. You have a scroll bar at the top. If I click on these arrows, the calendar is going to move by 1 day increments, either to the left or to the right. So if I click on the arrow, you'll see 1 day increment has passed. You can use that to view all of the information, clicking one arrow at a time. That can be a bit tedious. So instead, you can click in between an arrow and the scroll bar. That will incur a page increment, which is 10 days. You can also simply drag the scroll bar. Another way to navigate through the timeline is by using the scroll increment. So the scroll increment is going to increase the number of days after the start date. So if we want to look at 5 days after the start date, we simply enter 5 and hit enter. So instead of the 20th of February, displaying the 25th of February. If we enter 200 days, and it's 200 days past the 20th of February. So those are the different ways you can navigate through this information. You can also modify how the scroll bar works. If you right-click on the scroll bar and select Format Control, this is the definition of your scroll bar. So you can see the current value is what's displayed in the scroll increment. Minimum value is 0, maximum is 365 days, that's 1 year. Incremental change is 1 day, so that's clicking on your arrows. Page change is 10 days, so that's clicking in between an arrow and the scroll bar. And of course, it's linked to the scroll increment, which is cell B5. You can change any of these entries to modify how the pages move for your situation. One final point to note on this worksheet. If we scroll down, you'll find there are only 200 entries permitted. That's simply to maintain the size and the quality of the spreadsheet functionality. Also, if you are dealing with more than 200 tasks in a project, perhaps a spreadsheet isn't the best way to track that, and you might want to investigate some alternate methods instead. Now let's look at our charts on the overview worksheet. We have a cost chart, plan versus actual, and we have our task status. So first and foremost, it's important to note that both of these charts are pivot charts. So the data is collected from pivot tables. That means when you enter new data, so that's new information on task entry, then you need to refresh the charts. Remember, we added a task entry. We added entry number 17, new task. Let's look at the task status first. Now you might be wondering why we have to refresh since the information here says there are 17 tasks, and we know there are. Well, actually, this information is a calculation not based on the pivot table. It's the pivot chart that's not displaying the correct information. If you count the total display here, you'll see there are only 16 tasks displayed here. The calculation is accurate with 17. So if we want to see the 17 tasks, we're going to have to refresh. Also, look at the costs up here. When we refresh, we should also see that amount changed because that new task entry was a cost of $1,000. So you only need to refresh with one chart, not both. You click either chart. When you do, you see an additional selection of menus appear at the top. You want to click on Analyze. You're going to click Refresh. On our task status, now you see there are 12 tasks planned, and now the total is 17. So it's important to note anytime you add a new task, you do need to refresh the charts. Now, the cost chart can be filtered in different ways. So right now, you'll see there are a number of selections. I'm going to call these blocks. There's a status block, a priority block, stage phase block, and a category block. You have different ways of using the blocks. I'll use status to demonstrate. If I click on completed, you'll see the other boxes are no longer selected. They're not colored. And you'll see there's a corresponding change in information displayed on your chart. That's a single selection. If you want to make more than one selection, you have two choices. You can click on the multi-select entry, and now that that's enabled, I can select additional items. Or you can deselect multi-select, and instead you can click on a button and drag, and it will select whatever you clicked and dragged on. So a couple of different choices there. Also, if you had something selected, you can click Clear Filter to remove all of the filters and display everything. And again, you saw the corresponding changes on the chart itself. So let's look at the cost information. On row 3, you have totals. This information is calculated for you, and it's based on everything. Regardless of what's displayed, it's giving you all of the costs. So plan costs and the actual costs. The filtered totals, on the other hand, are only reflecting the information currently displayed in the chart. So you see the only difference right now is $1,000 between filtered and totals. So this is important to note because budgeting has not been included in the overall calculations. So you might look in the phase block and think all you need to do is highlight budgeting. However, it has been highlighted. You can see it has a slight coloration to the background. That means it has been selected. It just doesn't have any data to display. And why is that? Because the administrative task, which was the category we selected for task entry, see administrative task, that has not been selected, so that's why it's not showing. So if I click and drag everything here, you'll see the filters are now engaged. In fact, if I undo that and simply clear filter, remember, will display everything, then the results are the same. One last thing to note, there is a hidden worksheet. You click on any existing worksheet, or rather right-click on any existing worksheet and select Unhide, and then select that sheet. The reason this is hidden is because this contains the pivot tables that are used in the pivot charts. You really don't need to do anything with the pivot tables. They're simply there to generate the information. Therefore, they've been hidden since you don't have to actively engage with them. But they're there just so that you can see where the information comes from. So that's everything. That's how you use the Project Planner template. I hope you find it useful.